Well, hey there, Year 12s. You're watching video number 3 now about the Middle East, and this episode, I guess, is called "Too Many Cooks in the Kitchen: Palestine and the UN." When we left things off at the end of the last video, Britain having promised the Arabs, the state having promised the Jews a national home, they're really not wanting to offend either party. Basically, tried to wash their hands of the whole mess with Palestine and referred the situation to the UN. So we're going to explore how this all went down in 1947 in the course of this short little video. So let's have a bit of a look here. So when the United Nations General Assembly met in April 1947, now the United Nations was only 2 years old at this point in time, and Britain had requested that there be a committee set up of relatively neutral nations to investigate what could be done about Palestine. And what they were supposed to do was to provide a plan, basically, for what would happen to Palestine moving forward. Remember that prior to this, Britain had a mandate over Palestine, and they had suggested that one side could be a Jewish Palestine, one side could be an Arab Palestine, and neither groups were really very happy with that proposal. And so in September, so after a few months of deliberation, a majority of the members of this group proposed a plan that involved partitioning Palestine, splitting it into two independent states with some economic union. So essentially they would rule their own sides, but they would work together economically. It was assumed that Palestine was going to be granted independence, but no one could really decide on what would happen next and how that would all happen. The British were prepared to just leave, essentially, and let the UN clean up the mess. So a special committee suggested a potential three-way partition. So on the one hand, we have an Arab state, we also have a Jewish state, and then we have an internationalized Jerusalem, all, again, experiencing economic union. Others recommended having a federal state, so the entire thing just being the one country. And during this time, while all of this deliberation is going on at the United Nations, there were 80,000 British troops trying to keep order against increasingly savage attacks on both them and now a civil war between the Jews and the Arabs, because they're still trying to clamour for superiority as this is all going on. So in November of 1947, there's a vote by these UN countries, the countries involved. They voted on whether Palestine should be partitioned. And if we have a look here, I'll just move my head just for a brief moment there. We can see that there were 33 votes approving the partition of Palestine into two states with an internationalized Jerusalem. Australia was one of those countries, as well as Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Denmark, New Zealand, Norway, Peru. Probably most important here, the US voted for the partition Palestine. Then there were 13 countries who voted no, we don't want this to take place, we don't want there to be this partition. And if you notice with most of these countries, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Turkey, Yemen, all of these countries are Arab countries, all of them basically saying no, we don't want this region to be split, we don't want there to be a Jewish state and an Arab state, that's not what we're after. There were also 10 countries who voted to abstain, they voted not to vote at all, and probably the biggest one to note here is the United Kingdom. So having made this mess, rather than trying to take sides on this particular vote, they decided no, it's better for us to keep our noses out of this one and to not get ourselves involved. And so we really need to consider what was going to take place with the UN and also the influence of the US. We'll get to that in a second. Here's a map that we're going to have a look at over the next couple of videos, just as I move my head down here. On the left-hand side, we can see the plan that the United Nations had come up with in 1947. And so this blue area was the proposed Jewish state. Now, we've got to keep in mind that there is no east-west split here. It's no north-south split. It is really a quite convoluted set of suggestions here, I guess. So in the blue we have the proposed Jewish state. In the brown, the Arab state. So what we now know as the Gaza Strip along here. And this area here is known as the West Bank because it is on the west of the Dead Sea. Not to be confused with this bit of land up here, which could also be, I guess, known as the West Bank, seeing as it is right up there against the Mediterranean Sea. And then this red area, including Jerusalem and Bethlehem, that was designed to be this internationally administered Jerusalem, which had been suggested before. What you can see on the right here, though, is what would happen just 2 years later, where you have the proposed Jewish state in blue. We're going to see that a war takes place once Israel is established in 1948, and this war goes on for a bit over, around about a year. And the Israelis, the Jews, they win this particular war, and they manage to claim a whole lot of extra land, this purple land, that had previously been promised to the Arabs. So this is just something for us to keep in mind as we move forward. So, in partitioning Palestine, the Jerusalem area, which included Bethlehem, there were about 100,000 Jews and around about 100,000 Palestinians as well. Now this was to become a corpus separatum, which was going to be administered or run by the UN. And so Jews who had about a third of the population at this time, and who had owned about 6 to 8% of the total land, and 20% of that was arable land, so land that they could farm on. They were going to receive, in this partition plan, 56% of the total land area, while the Arabs got 43%. And so it's not a 50-50 split. The Jews were going to be promised more of the land, even though there were less of them. The Arab territory, to add insult to injury for the Arabs, was going to be less fertile, while the Jews, their territory was going to be far more fertile along the coasts. So the Jews were going to have the economic upper hand when it came to farming in particular. And the Jewish state would also exclude the most holy places for Jews, which involved Jerusalem and Hebron. So just a couple of things to keep in mind, that this plan didn't necessarily work for Jews in its entirety, didn't necessarily work for the Arabs in its entirety either. So let's have a look at what the global response was to this particular plan. So, the partition resolution was strongly supported by the Soviet Union and by other communist countries. They felt like the Israeli leaders, that they had a socialist ideology, and that was something that they could work with, as opposed to a real capitalist mindset. So they felt like the Soviet Union were going to have an ally in Israel. So they were all for this partition plan, that the Jews would be able to have their own state. Britain, as mentioned before, announced that they weren't going to cooperate with any execution of the plan. They weren't going to be involved at all. They tried to wash their hands of the whole mess, and they had said, well, from the 15th of May 1948, we're bringing our troops home. They're not going to be in Palestine anymore. The US, well, they also supported the resolution, mostly for domestic reasons, and this is something that we need to consider. The US knew that the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine would relieve the pressure for a whole lot of large-scale immigration of Jewish Holocaust survivors to America. So they basically agreed with this partition plan because they knew that it would mean that less people would come to America and that more of them would go to Israel. So it relieved pressure for them, it reduced the burden of these Holocaust survivors rolling up on their doorstep, and so if they could have them go somewhere else, of course they were going to be all for that plan. The Jewish Agency, they welcomed the partition resolution, celebrating in the streets of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, because they were finally, officially, going to have not only their national home, but a state, a country, to call their own. The Arab response, though, was a little bit different. Like we saw with the vote, A lot of those countries who voted no were Arab countries, and the Arabs who lived in Palestine, well, they denounced the UN resolution, refusing to set up a provisional government for this proposed Arab state. They called it general strike, rioting, attacks on Jews breaking out all over the country. And what they said was, you can see in this quote here, the UNO, the United Nations, has set the Arabs and Jews in the Middle East irrevocably against each other and made war inevitable. Basically, the UN has stuffed this up, and any hope of there being peace between the two groups and us working out a workable solution, that's gone. Despite this, the leader of the Jewish Agency in 1947 saying, well, when this new Jewish state is created, we don't think there's going to be a mass migration of Jews from Europe to Palestine. We don't think the numbers are going to grow that much. That wasn't necessarily going to be the case, but that's what was promised. And as we know, the Palestinians have been promised a lot and not received what they've been promised. And so the Arab League, the Arabs responded by forming something known as the Arab Liberation Army in early 1948. Now, in March, there were around 5,000 Arabs from other countries fighting in Palestine, all of those countries that were right nearby. And there were very few Palestinian Arabs who actually joined the ALA. They suspected that this Liberation Army, they had intentions for their territory, the Palestinian territory, which may not have included an independent Palestinian state. So basically, if Egyptian soldiers had been fighting in the Liberation Army, that if they were to win back land, that Egypt would try and claim that rather than protecting that land for the Palestinians. And so, over the course of the next few months, you have Jews who are celebrating the fact that they're going to have their own nation. But as much as they were celebrating, there was also this determination from the Arabs to make sure that partition did not take place, that it would not happen. And so essentially what we have now is a civil war where both sides, both Jews and Arabs, are turning increasingly to terrorist activities against each other. In the city of Haifa, there were some particularly brutal attacks. On the 9th of April in 1948, 200 civilians in an Arab village were killed by Israeli forces, by the group that we've talked about before, the Irgun. Arab forces also did their own attacks, attacking a Jewish medical convoy near Jerusalem, killing 77 doctors, nurses, teachers and students, basically becoming a tit for tat. You did this to us, so we're going to do something else to you. And so in March 1948, there are British forces still in Palestine, but Jerusalem is pretty well in the hands of the Arabs. By April, fast forward only 1 month, the Haganah, the Jewish military, they'd gained control in Jerusalem, and Arabs at this point are now leaving their homes in fear, knowing that in May they're going to potentially lose their land when the British leave. And between 419,000 and 726, that's the number estimated by historians, as people who would leave their homes in preparation for the independence of Israel in 1948. So we'll leave it there in this video. As you can see, we've got some countries who are really keen for this partition to take place, and the UN is trying to make that happen, but obviously the people in Palestine, many of them are not happy with the way that it's going down, and we'll see what happens in the next video as to how this all resolves itself.